Alicia Johnson had lived in the same neighborhood for 5 years. She was a kind woman, always smiling and helping people. She loved baking, gardening, and chatting with friendly neighbors. But there was one person who never smiled back, Mr. Wilkins. Mr. Wilkins lived next door, but he acted like Alicia didn't exist. He was an old man with gray hair and a wrinkled face. Whenever Alicia walked by, he would look away or close his door. Sometimes she even heard him mumbling under his breath. She didn't know exactly what he said, but she knew it wasn't nice. Other neighbors had warned Alicia about him. "He doesn't like people who are different," one woman whispered. "He's been here for years and doesn't want new people moving in." Alicia didn't like trouble, so she had always ignored Mr. Wilkins. But deep inside, she felt sad. She believed people could change if they were shown kindness. One afternoon, as Alicia was baking cookies in her kitchen, an idea popped into her head. What if she gave some to Mr. Wilkins? Maybe he had never been treated with kindness before. Maybe a simple plate of cookies could make a difference. She laughed at herself. "That's silly," she thought. But as she took the warm cookies out of the oven, the sweet smell filled the room, and she couldn't shake the idea. Alicia carefully placed the cookies on a plate. She wrapped them in a clean white napkin and took a deep breath. "Why not?" she said to herself. She stepped outside and walked to Mr. Wilkins' front door. The sun was shining, but the air felt heavy. Her hands felt a little sweaty as she knocked on the door. There was silence. Then, slow footsteps. The door creaked open just an inch. Mr. Wilkins' face appeared in the gap. His eyes narrowed when he saw her. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice rough. Alicia held up the plate and smiled. "Hi, Mr. Wilkins. I made some cookies and thought you might like some." For a moment, he just stared. His face was hard, unreadable. Then, his eyes moved down to the cookies. "What's this supposed to mean?" he grumbled. "It doesn't mean anything," Alicia said, still smiling. "Just being neighborly." He looked at her, then at the cookies again. Finally, he reached out and took the plate. "Emph," he muttered, stepping back inside. The door shut without another word. Alicia stood there for a second, unsure how to feel. She had expected a thank you, or at least a polite nod. Instead, she got nothing. Shaking her head, she turned and walked back home. "At least I tried," she thought. She had no idea that just a few minutes later, her act of kindness would lead to flashing lights and police officers at her door. Alicia went back inside her house and sat down with a cup of tea. She wasn't sure how to feel about what had just happened. Mr. Wilkins had taken the cookies, but he hadn't said thank you. He hadn't smiled. He hadn't even looked at her properly. Maybe I shouldn't have bothered, she thought. But deep down, she still hoped that maybe, just maybe, her small act of kindness would change something. A few minutes passed. Alicia was about to turn on the TV when she heard a sound outside. It wasn't just any sound. It was sirens. She stood up and walked to the window. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw 2 police cars pull up in front of her house. "What in the world?" she whispered. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the windows. Neighbors started peeking out of their doors, watching the scene unfold. Alicia's stomach tightened as she saw 2 police officers step out of their cars. One of them, a tall man with a serious face, walked toward her front door. Then came a loud knock. Boom, boom, boom. Alicia's hands felt cold as she reached for the doorknob. She had done nothing wrong. Why were the police here? Slowly, she opened the door. "Ma'am, are you Alicia Johnson?" the officer asked. "Yes," she said, her voice steady but confused. "Is something wrong?" The officer exchanged a look with his partner. "We received a call from one of your neighbors, Mr. Wilkins. He claims you tried to poison him." Alicia's eyes widened. What? She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Poison. How could anyone think that? "I gave him cookies," she said, her voice firm. "Homemade cookies, that's all." The second officer, a woman with short hair, looked at her closely. "Mr. Wilkins says he felt sick after eating them," she said. "He claims you might have put something in them." Alicia felt anger rise in her chest. She had tried to be kind, and now she was being accused of something terrible. "That's ridiculous," she said. I eat those same cookies myself. My friends and family have eaten them for years. Why would I do something like that?" The first officer sighed. "We understand, ma'am, but we have to check these things out." Alicia folded her arms. "Did he actually get sick?" she asked. "Or is he just saying that?" The officers didn't answer right away. That told Alicia everything she needed to know. Just then, another voice broke through the tension. "Grandpa, stop this." Alicia turned her head and saw a teenage girl running toward them. She had curly blonde hair and wore a hoodie and jeans. The girl stopped in front of the officers, breathing hard. "I ate the cookies too," she said. "They're fine. Nothing is wrong with them." The officers turned back to Alicia. Alicia's heart was still racing, but she forced herself to stay calm. "You see," she said, "I didn't do anything wrong." One of the officers sighed. "All right," he said. "If she's fine, then it doesn't seem like there's a real issue here." The officers exchanged looks, then nodded. "We'll talk to Mr. Wilkins," the woman officer said. "Sorry for the trouble, ma'am." Alicia took a deep breath and nodded. "Thank you," she said, though her voice was tight. As the officers turned and walked toward Wilkins' house, Alicia met the teenage girl's eyes. "I'm sorry about my grandpa," the girl said softly. "He's stubborn." Alicia nodded, her anger melting just a little. "Thank you for speaking up," she said. The girl gave a small smile before walking away. Alicia watched as the police knocked on Mr. Wilkins' door. He peeked out but didn't step outside. The officers talked to him for a while, and finally, after a few minutes, they left. The police cars drove away. The flashing lights disappeared. The neighborhood went quiet again. But Alicia knew things wouldn't be the same after this. She had tried to show kindness, and now she had a decision to make. Would she give up, or would she keep believing that kindness could change even the coldest hearts? Alicia stood on her porch, watching the police cars disappear down the street. The evening air felt heavy, like a storm was about to come. Neighbors who had been peeking through their windows slowly pulled away. A few of them still stood outside, whispering to each other. Alicia sighed and stepped inside, locking the door behind her. She leaned against the door for a moment, closing her eyes. She had only wanted to be kind. How had it turned into this? Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her best friend, Lisa. "Girl, what happened? I just saw cops at your house." Alicia shook her head and typed back. "Long story. Wilkins called them on me, said I poisoned his cookies." A few seconds later, Lisa's reply popped up. "Whatchet? I told you not to bother with that man. Are you okay?" Alicia smiled a little. Lisa always worried about her. "I'm fine, just frustrated." She put her phone down and walked to the kitchen. The plate of cookies she had kept for herself was still sitting on the counter. She picked one up and took a bite, shaking her head. "Poison?" she muttered to herself. "Please." She thought about Mr. Wilkins. Had he really believed she would do something so terrible, or had he just wanted to cause trouble? Maybe he didn't want to admit that a black woman had done something nice for him. Alicia sighed and sat down at the table. Her mind kept going back to Wilkins' granddaughter, the girl who had spoken up for her. That had surprised her. Maybe not everyone in that house was full of hate. Just then, there was a soft knock at the door. Alicia's body tensed. She wasn't sure she wanted to open it. What if it was Wilkins, or another problem waiting for her? Slowly, she walked to the door and looked through the peephole. It was the girl. Alicia hesitated for a second before opening the door. The teenager stood there, hands in the pocket of her hoodie. She looked nervous. "Hey," the girl said. "Hey," Alicia replied. "Everything okay?" The girl nodded. I wanted to say sorry again. My grandpa was wrong to do that." Alicia studied her face. She looked embarrassed, maybe even a little sad. "What's your name?" Alicia asked. "Emma," the girl said. "I know my grandpa can be mean. He doesn't like change. He doesn't like new people. But I didn't think he'd go this far." Alicia folded her arms. "He could have gotten me arrested," she said, "all because I tried to be nice." Emma looked down at her shoes. "I know," she said softly, "and I told him he was wrong. But he's stubborn. He doesn't listen to me much." Alicia sighed, her frustration softening just a little. She could see that Emma was different from her grandfather. Maybe the girl was trying to make things right in her own way. "Thank you for standing up for me," Alicia said. "That took courage." Emma gave a small smile. "I just told the truth," she said. "Anyway, I should go. But I just wanted to say I'm really sorry about what happened." Alicia nodded. "I appreciate that." Emma turned to leave, but then hesitated. "Oh," she said, "one more thing." She reached into her pocket and pulled out something wrapped in a napkin. She held it out to Alicia. Alicia raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" Emma gave a shy smile. "A cookie," she said. "I made them. Thought you might like to try one." Alicia blinked in surprise. Then, slowly, she smiled. Maybe kindness wasn't wasted after all. Alicia stood in her doorway, staring at the napkin-wrapped cookie in Emma's hand. She hadn't expected this. First, the police. Now, the granddaughter of the man who called them was offering her a cookie. She hesitated for a moment, then took it. "You made this?" she asked. Emma nodded. "I know it's not as good as yours," she said quickly. I wanted to do something nice." Alicia unwrapped the cookie and looked at it. It was a little misshapen, and the chocolate chips weren't spread evenly, but it smelled good. She took a small bite. It was actually pretty tasty. Alicia smiled. "Not bad," she said. Emma's face lit up. "Really?" Alicia nodded. "A little too much sugar, but it's good." Emma laughed. "Yeah, I kinda guessed on the measurements." For a moment, the tension from earlier melted away. Alicia wasn't thinking about Mr. Wilkins. She wasn't thinking about the police or the neighbors watching from their windows. It was just her and this teenage girl, bonding over cookies. She took another bite and looked at Emma. "So, what made you come over?" Emma shrugged. "I don't know. I guess I just felt bad. I mean, my grandpa was wrong to do what he did. I told him that." Alicia raised an eyebrow. "And how did that go?" Emma sighed. "Not great. He got mad and said I don't understand how the world works. But I think he doesn't understand. He's stuck in the past, and he doesn't want to change." Alicia nodded slowly. "People like that are hard to reach." Emma looked down at her feet. "I don't want to be like him," she said. "I love my grandpa, but I don't agree with him. I don't want to judge people just because they're different." Alicia felt a warmth spread in her chest. Maybe this was the real change, the next generation choosing a different path. She studied Emma for a moment. "You know," she said, "when I was your age, I had an old neighbor too. She didn't like me at first either, but over time, things changed. Sometimes, all it takes is one moment to make someone see things differently." Emma gave a small smile. "I don't know if my grandpa will ever change." Alicia nodded. "Maybe not, but you already have, and that's something." Emma looked thoughtful for a moment. Then she straightened up. "I should go, but can I come back sometime?" Alicia smiled. "Of course." Emma grinned. "Cool. Maybe you can teach me how to bake cookies that aren't too sweet." Alicia chuckled. "Deal." Emma turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, one more thing," she said. "I think my grandpa did eat one of your cookies. He just didn't want to admit it." Alicia laughed. "Figures." Emma waved as she walked away, heading back to her house. Alicia watched her go, feeling something she hadn't expected to feel after everything that had happened. Hope. Maybe Mr. Wilkins would never change, but his granddaughter, she already had. And maybe that was enough. The next morning, Alicia sat on her porch, sipping a cup of coffee. The neighborhood was quiet. Birds chirped in the trees, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves. Everything seemed peaceful, but Alicia's mind was still racing from the events of the day before. She thought about Emma. The girl had been brave to stand up for her. Maybe there was hope for the future after all. But then she thought about Mr. Wilkins. Would he ever change, or was he too stuck in his old ways? Alicia sighed and shook her head. "I did my part," she muttered. "That's all I can do." She was about to go back inside when she heard something strange. Footsteps on her porch. She turned around. Her eyes widened. Mr. Wilkins stood there, looking uncomfortable. Alicia blinked in surprise. He had never come near her house before. In fact, he had always acted like she didn't exist. And now, here he was, standing on her porch, shifting from foot to foot like he didn't know what to say. Alicia folded her arms. "Mr. Wilkins," she said, "did you get lost?" The old man sighed. No, his voice was gruff, but there was something different in his tone, something Alicia couldn't quite place. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, he cleared his throat. I suppose I owe you an apology," he said, still not meeting her eyes. Alicia raised an eyebrow. "You suppose?" He let out a short breath. "Fine, I do. I shouldn't have called the police. That was wrong." Alicia didn't say anything. She just waited. Wilkins rubbed the back of his neck. "Emma wouldn't leave me alone about it," he admitted. "Told me I embarrassed her. Said I needed to come talk to you." Alicia almost smiled. She could imagine Emma scolding her grandfather, refusing to let him ignore what he had done. "I thought those cookies were some kind of trick," Wilkins continued. Well, never mind what I thought. But I was wrong." Alicia watched him carefully. She could see how hard this was for him. The old man wasn't used to admitting he was wrong. "Emma told me you ate one," Alicia said. Wilkins' lips pressed into a thin line. "Maybe." Alicia chuckled, and he sighed. It was fine. Alicia shook her head, a small smile on her lips. "You're really bad at giving compliments, huh?" Wilkins grumbled under his breath, but didn't deny it. Then, after a long pause, he said, "Look, I don't expect us to be friends or anything, but I shouldn't have treated you the way I did." Alicia studied him for a moment. "Why did you treat me that way?" Wilkins looked away, his face tight. "It's just how I grew up. Things were different back then." Alicia nodded slowly. "And now?" Wilkins sighed again. "Now, I don't know, but Emma seems to think I should try to be better." Alicia tilted her head. "And what do you think?" Wilkins finally met her gaze. "I think it wouldn't hurt to try." Alicia took a deep breath. She hadn't expected this. She had assumed Wilkins would stay the same forever. But maybe, even after all these years, people could change. "All right," she said. "How about this? Next time I bake cookies, I'll bring some over. You don't have to call the cops this time." Wilkins huffed. "I guess that sounds fair." Alicia smiled. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A few days passed, and Alicia couldn't stop thinking about her conversation with Mr. Wilkins. She had spent so long avoiding him, assuming he would never change. Now, for the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was a chance. But words were one thing. Actions were another. So that afternoon, Alicia decided to test him. She put on her apron and got to work in the kitchen. The smell of fresh cookies filled the house, warm chocolate chip, just like last time. But this time, she wasn't just baking for herself. She had a plan. Once the cookies were ready, she placed a few on a plate, covered it with plastic wrap, and took a deep breath. Then she stepped outside. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. Alicia walked across the yard and up the steps to Mr. Wilkins' porch. For a second, she hesitated. Would he slam the door in her face? Would he pretend their conversation never happened? There was only one way to find out. She knocked. A long silence followed. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. Mr. Wilkins stood there, his usual scowl on his face. But this time, it wasn't as sharp. He looked at Alicia, then at the plate in her hands. "You again," he muttered. Alicia smirked. "Told you I'd bring cookies." Wilkins glanced around, as if checking to see if anyone was watching. Then he sighed and stepped aside. "Well, guess you'd better come in." Alicia blinked. She hadn't expected that. Still, she didn't hesitate. She stepped inside, her eyes quickly scanning the living room. It was neat, but old-fashioned. Faded wallpaper, a worn-out recliner, a black and white photo of a young Wilkins in uniform. "Sit if you want," Wilkins said gruffly, waving toward the couch. Alicia sat down, placing the plate on the coffee table. Wilkins slowly lowered himself into his chair, eyeing the cookies like they might jump up and bite him. After a long pause, he reached forward, grabbed one, and took a bite. Alicia watched, waiting. Wilkins chewed slowly, then let out a small grunt. Not bad. Alicia smirked. You sure know how to make a person feel appreciated. Wilkins huffed. I said they weren't bad. Don't push your luck. Alicia laughed. She hadn't expected to feel comfortable sitting in this man's house, but strangely, she did. As Wilkins ate another cookie, Alicia glanced at the photo on the wall. That you? She asked, pointing. Wilkins looked up. For a moment, his expression softened. Yeah, a long time ago. You were in the army. Wilkins nodded. Served overseas. Thought I was fighting for a better country. Alicia leaned back. And now? Wilkins sighed, staring at the picture. Now I wonder if I ever really knew what that meant. Alicia didn't say anything. She let his words hang in the air. After a while, Wilkins cleared his throat. Emma's been on my case, he admitted. Says I should stop being so bitter. Says I should try to be better. Alicia smiled. Emma's smart. Wilkins grumbled. Too smart for her own good. Alicia chuckled. Then, after a moment, she said, You know, change isn't easy. But it's possible. You don't have to do it all at once. Just take a step. Wilkins looked at her, then at the cookies. He sighed. Guess this is a step, huh? Alicia nodded. A small one. But yeah. Wilkins sat back in his chair, chewing thoughtfully. Guess we'll see where it leads. Alicia smiled. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. Alicia sat on Mr. Wilkins' couch, watching as he slowly finished his second cookie. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't exactly friendly either. It was careful. Wilkins took a deep breath and set his empty plate down on the coffee table. So, what now? He asked, raising an eyebrow. Alicia smirked. I don't know. You invited me in, ate my cookies, and didn't call the cops this time. That's progress. Wilkins grunted, but there was a tiny twitch at the corner of his mouth, almost a smile. Almost. Alicia glanced around the room again. The house was clean, but filled with old memories. The military photo wasn't the only one on the wall. There were other pictures, too, some of a younger Wilkins with a woman and a little boy. Alicia's eyes lingered on them. Wilkins noticed and sighed. That was my wife, Margaret, he said, and my son, Thomas. Alicia nodded. They look happy. Wilkins' face darkened a little. Margaret passed away 15 years ago. Thomas. He trailed off, then shook his head. We don't talk much. Alicia could hear the pain in his voice. She didn't push. Emma told me you were married, Wilkins said, changing the subject. Alicia smiled. I was. My husband, Jordan, passed away a few years back. Wilkins' expression softened. Sorry to hear that. Alicia nodded. Me too. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They were two very different people, different races, different backgrounds, different lives. And yet, in that moment, they shared something. Loss. Wilkins cleared his throat. Emma's been talking about you a lot, he said. Says you remind her of her mom. Alicia raised an eyebrow. Oh. Wilkins nodded. Her mom, my daughter-in-law, was always trying to help people, always pushing me to be a better person. She didn't care that I was set in my ways. He shook his head. Maybe she was right. Alicia leaned forward. What do you think she'd say if she saw you now? Wilkins chuckled dryly. She'd probably laugh and say, took you long enough. Alicia smiled. Sounds like a smart woman. Wilkins nodded. She was. He looked down at his hands. Emma takes after her. Alicia could hear the pride in his voice. He might be stubborn, but he cared about that girl more than anything. She decided to test something. So, I was thinking, Alicia said, you and I should have a little challenge. Wilkins raised an eyebrow. What kind of challenge? Alicia grinned. A baking challenge. Emma said she wants to learn how to bake properly. I figure we can both teach her. Wilkins scoffed. I don't bake. Alicia shrugged. Then learn. Wilkins shook his head. You're pushing your luck, lady. Alicia laughed. What's the worst that could happen? Wilkins grumbled something under his breath, but didn't say no. Alicia took that as a win. She stood up and grabbed the empty plate. All right, I'll let you think about it, but don't be surprised if Emma drags you into it anyway. Wilkins rolled his eyes but didn't argue. Alicia headed for the door. Just before she stepped outside, Wilkins called after her. "Hey." She turned. "Thanks for the cookies." Alicia smiled. "Anytime." As she walked back home, she couldn't help but feel lighter. Maybe change was slow, maybe it was just small steps, but it was happening. And that was enough. A week later, Alicia stood in her kitchen, mixing a fresh batch of cookie dough. She glanced at the clock. Emma would be arriving soon, along with her stubborn grandfather. She still wasn't sure if Wilkins would go through with it. He had grumbled and complained when Emma told him about their little baking challenge, but Alicia had seen the way his lips twitched, trying not to smile. He wanted to say no, but he didn't. A few minutes later, a knock sounded at her door. Alicia wiped her hands on a towel and opened it. Emma stood there, beaming. "We're ready." Behind her, Mr. Wilkins stood with his arms crossed, looking grumpy as ever. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. Alicia smirked. "Then why are you here?" Wilkins grunted but didn't answer. Instead, he stepped inside, glancing around her kitchen like it was enemy territory. Emma bounced excitedly. "Okay, what's first?" Alicia pulled out a second mixing bowl. "We're making 2 batches. One for me, one for your grandpa." Emma grinned. "Oh, this is gonna be fun." Wilkins sighed heavily. "Let's get this over with." Alicia chuckled and handed him a wooden spoon. "All right, first, we mix the butter and sugar." Wilkins took the spoon reluctantly and started stirring. His movements were stiff, but Alicia could tell he was trying. Emma leaned over to watch. "Grandpa, you look funny." Wilkins gave her a look. "I do not look funny." Emma giggled. "You totally do." Alicia laughed. "Don't worry, Wilkins. You'll get the hang of it." Slowly, the tension in the room eased. As they mixed ingredients, Emma talked about school, about her favorite TV shows, and about the book she was reading. Wilkins listened quietly, occasionally throwing in a comment. Alicia noticed something. He wasn't as cold as before. As the cookies baked, the warm scent filled the kitchen. Emma clapped her hands. "I bet Grandpa's cookies won't taste as good as Alicia's." Wilkins scoffed. "Excuse me, I followed the directions exactly." Alicia grinned. "We'll see." When the timer dinged, Alicia took the trays out and set them on the counter. They all waited a few minutes before trying them. Emma was the first to take a bite of Wilkins' cookies. She chewed slowly, then her eyes widened. "Grandpa, these are actually good." Wilkins smirked. "Of course they are." Alicia took a bite too. She raised an eyebrow. "Not bad, Wilkins. Maybe you've got a hidden talent." Wilkins chuckled. "Don't get any ideas." They sat at the kitchen table, eating cookies together. The conversation flowed more easily now, the tension from before almost gone. After a while, Wilkins looked at Alicia. "You know, I was wrong about you." Alicia met his eyes. "I know." He sighed. "I spent so long thinking things had to stay the way they were, that people like me and people like you couldn't get along." Alicia nodded, waiting. "But Emma was right," Wilkins admitted. "I can change. I don't know how much, but I'm willing to try." Alicia smiled. "That's all that matters." Wilkins picked up another cookie. "Guess I owe you for putting up with me." Alicia laughed. "You can start by making more cookies next time." Emma cheered. "Yes. Grandpa's joining the baking team." Wilkins groaned. "What have I gotten myself into?" They all laughed, and for the first time, Alicia saw something new in Wilkins' eyes. Not just tolerance, not just acceptance, but friendship. It had taken time, patience, and a plate of cookies, but change had come, and that was just the beginning.